So welcome everyone to the US-Asia Law Institute's weekly speaker program on Asian law. I'm Katherine Wilhelm, Executive Director of the Institute. And today we're talking about one of the most impactful pieces of foreign relations legislation that China has passed in recent years, the 2017 Foreign NGO Law. Before we get into the program, I want to make a quick announcement. Next Wednesday, October 20th, our weekly speaker program will not be at the usual time. We are going to begin at 8 p.m. And run until 9:30 p.m. Our topic is sanctions and human rights, lessons from Hong Kong. And our speaker will be Carol Peterson of the University of Hawaii. Today, our topic, of course, is the future of overseas nonprofits or NGOs in China. And the foreign relations legislation that I just mentioned is formally known as the PRC law for the management of the activities inside China of overseas non-government nonprofit organizations. And because that's such a mouthful, we tend to call it the ONGO law, overseas NGO law, or the international NGO law, or just plain the NGO law. And January is going to mark the 5th anniversary of this law taking effect. It was China's first ever law of general application regulating non-mainland nonprofits, and it sent shockwaves through the international NGO community because of the thoroughness with which it enveloped NGOs in a blanket of regulation and supervision under the management of the police. And it confirmed that in the eyes of the Chinese leadership, foreign nonprofits' contributions to the know-how and funding for economic and social development was secondary to the potential security threat that they posed. NGOs were suspect because of their reputed role in the so-called color revolutions in the former Soviet republics and in the Arab Spring. So 5 years on, we can see this law as part of a pattern of society-wide securitization that has affected Chinese domestic civil society, domestic private businesses, particularly recently we've seen, and to some extent foreign businesses, for example, through intensifying cybersecurity regulation. Foreign businesses are experiencing very intensive government regulation that exceeds what they experience in their home countries. And meanwhile, China's government relations with many Western countries are the worst they've been in my lifetime. According to the Pew Research Center, negative views towards China have reached historic highs in many countries. In the US, 9 out of 10 Americans say that China is a competitor or an enemy. The US is home to the largest number of foreign nonprofits that work in China. So what do these attitudes mean for continued NGO or nonprofit cooperation and exchanges? So here to discuss these and other tough questions are Jessica Batke of the Asia Society's China File and Mark Sidel of the University of Wisconsin Law School. Both bring great expertise to our discussion. Jessica has been the editor of the China NGO Project, which is a community-driven online platform focused on NGOs working in China. And full disclosure, I provided seed funding for this project when I was at the Ford Foundation before coming to NYU. Jessica researches China's domestic political and social affairs, and she was in the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research for nearly 8 years before she moved to China File. And she also writes about China's Xinjiang region. And Mark teaches and writes about nonprofit law at the University of Wisconsin. He's a consultant to the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law. Like me, he was a program officer at the Ford Foundation in Beijing, and he also worked for Ford in Hanoi, I think Bangkok, and New Delhi. And he's been advising and writing about China's overseas NGO law ever since it was in draft form. So that's even before 2017. and he is doing comparative research about government controls on foreign nonprofit funding and activities in other Asian countries. So we'll also be asking about that. So Jessica is going to get us going. I'm going to hand the mic to you, Jessica, and you can share your screen.
Great. Yeah, I'll share my screen in a moment. Thanks so much for having me here. Let's talk about the implementation of this law in 2017. What changed in 2017? You know, as Katherine said, this was an attempt to get rid of the gray areas in which so many nonprofits had been operating. It really enveloped the entire community and tried to define all the spaces and where people were able to operate and not operate. So it was no longer possible for an international NGO to just kind of show up and rent an office without any real threat of consequences. And that's what a lot of nonprofits had been doing prior to the implementation of the law. A really important aspect of this law is that it moved, this is going to sound very bureaucratic and weedy, but it's actually quite important. It moved oversight of international nonprofits from the Bureau of Civil Affairs to the Ministry of Public Security. And this is really important because it underscores how the Chinese government views international nonprofits. As was already mentioned, they're viewed as a potential threat that needs to be monitored and managed. And this isn't just about managing groups that are already there. It's also about deciding who's allowed in and who isn't. So the Ministry of Public Security, the MPS, and its local offices are now the gatekeepers for who can work legally in the country. And it really matters which institutional authority is making these decisions. And coming at it from a public security lens really changes how nonprofits are allowed to operate. So what do we know? This law went into effect in 2017. How do we know, what do we know about how this has affected international nonprofits in China? All of us have lots of, anecdotes, maybe some personal experiences. There's some trends you can see, but in terms of really hard numbers, it's really hard to know comprehensively what's happening because we don't have a good baseline of what was happening before the law went into effect. There was no comprehensive list of who was operating, which international nonprofits was operating in China prior to 2017. This gets back to these gray areas, right? And therefore, there's no accurate way to know, again, comprehensively what's changed. And particularly if you're talking about smaller nonprofits, maybe they were there under the radar before, so we don't know what happened to them if they've left. So I'm going to share my screen now. So what do we know and how can we learn about what's going on? What I do is collate the data, official data that the Ministry of Public Security makes public. And it's really important to be clear about what these data can and cannot tell us. So we'll first go through what the data can tell us about what's happening in China. So the most important thing to know is that this data only tells us about who's been successful, right? It tells you who has successfully opened up a representative office. Representative office just means you have a permanent presence in China. You've got an office there, you've got staff, and you go through a mechanism under the law called establishing a representative office. If you don't want to have a permanent presence there, you can file for a temporary activity. That can be a couple days long, it can be up to a year long. Maybe you want to have a conference, maybe you want to donate funds to help rebuild something after a flood. People would go through the temporary activity mechanism for something like that. So the data tells us about who's doing that, but it only tells us about who applied and was successfully allowed to do those things. So we can see, just in terms of the offices that are there, there's been a kind of drop off over time. There's just under 600 foreign NGOs that have a representative office. It can seem like a lot, but if you think about how many people are in China, it's actually a fairly small number. And it's hard to really know, how the pandemic has affected this. There was a lower number of registrations in the last 2 years. I have no idea whether that's going to pick up or if that's just kind of the baseline that we have now. There are many more temporary activities than offices, not a surprise. Again, there's been a slow decline since 2019, so it's kind of hard to know, is this the new normal or is this just a pandemic effect? And this is just to kind of show you that if you're opening an office in China, you tend to be in either Beijing or Shanghai. That's not really a surprise. But the really other important point here is that there's some places where no one has been able to open an office at all, right? And so if you look in the Northwest, Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, nobody. And weirdly in the middle in Shanxi, nobody. And maybe nobody's trying to open offices there. Maybe they've decided that they don't even want to bother trying. But it's interesting that, there's, I think Mark's going to talk about this later, there's a lot of local agency from the MPS and other officials in deciding whether you can be in certain places or not. And this is just to show you for temporary activities, there's a broader mix. More of them are happening in more places. I don't need to talk about that, but I'm happy to answer questions later if there are any. This is the really important part. This gets at the kind of work that foreign NGOs are able to do or not do. Right, so these are representative offices, and you'll notice that over half of them are representing trade or industry interests in some capacity. I believe it's over, I don't remember the exact number, but over half of them are doing that. And that's great. Those are legitimate nonprofits. They're just not necessarily the first thing that comes to mind when people think of NGOs. So it's really important to keep that in mind. And if you look over towards the right of the graphic, those are the sorts of issues that aren't being worked on by international NGOs, and that's not a coincidence. If you look at temporary activities, here we see a ton of groups doing education-related work, and that can be, ranging from giving out scholarships at very prestigious elite universities to helping kids in rural areas go to primary school. There's all different ways that can manifest. But again, if you look at the right side of this graphic, that's where we're, those are the issues that are not being attended to by international nonprofits. Again, not a coincidence. So what can this tell us, right? If you look at the groups that have been successful and what they're doing, we can infer which types of work are preferred by the Chinese government, right? Education, trade, industry, and which are discouraged. So any sort of media trainings, LGBTQ issues, all those sorts of things, it's really hard to get approved to work in China. And we can also infer which provinces are even interested in engaging with international NGOs. If you recall that map earlier, there's some provinces that are just not interested in having you there. Finally, I want to talk about what the official data don't tell us. And it's always really important to keep in mind the limitations of any information, any data set you're looking at, right? So going back to that first slide, when I said this only shows what was successful, we do not know what international NGOs applied for a representative office or filed for a temporary activity and were rejected. We don't know what sort of work they would have done. We don't know where they're from. We don't know which local NGOs or government offices they would have been working with. That's an alternate universe we don't have access to. So we don't know who wasn't approved. As I said before, we don't have a comprehensive list of who was there before, and we also don't have a comprehensive list of international NGOs that have left China since 2017, or who have decided against entering. I know that there's a couple groups who were thinking about opening an office in China, and after this law went into effect, they weren't sure whether that was for them anymore. We don't have a comprehensive list of domestic NGOs who have lost their international funders or partners who used to work with them directly in country and no longer can do that. And as I mentioned earlier, we don't really have a good sense of what we're looking at is the result directly of the pandemic or is a longer term trend. So if you're interested in any of this information, please feel free to go to the China NGO Project website. It's at chinafile.com/NGO. And I will leave it there and pass it along to Mark.
Thank you, Jessica, who, as always, has given a superb introduction and summary to the ONGO and ONGO law situation in China. Let me mention for a couple minutes, and I'm going to try to hold this to about 10 minutes, a few cross-cutting themes that at least I've been particularly interested in, some of which come out of the data and some of which come out of observation and discussion with colleagues We have a lot of people on the call today, and I'm particularly gratified to see a lot of colleagues from China who have worked on these issues, either from practice or from academic and policy perspectives. So welcome to all of you, and thanks, of course, to NYU and the US Asia Law Institute for putting this on. Let me mention 6 themes very briefly. First is that, as Katherine and Jessica mentioned, particularly Katherine at the beginning, there was in the original understanding, the original legal framework, a kind of carve-out for universities and research institutes in which their relationships with overseas NGOs would remain under previous state council and ministerial frameworks and regulations. That was always inherently contradictory, that would remain under Ministry of Education or other rules. At the same time, this new Ministry of Public Security directed ONGO legal regime was coming into place. And what we've seen in the past couple of years is that the universities and research institutes have been almost completely integrated into the ONGO law and ONGO framework. So the Ministry of Public Security is always a partner at the table with respect to these relationships. This is not just occurring in the ONGO framework. Sometimes we may overemphasize the overseas NGO context, but within the universities and research institutes, and we all know this, including our Chinese colleagues, we are seeing sharply strengthened party and internal security roles within universities and research bodies. And particularly on ONGO, we are seeing, especially at the provincial level, a much strengthened public security work on ONGO matters directly with universities and research institutes. If you follow the MPS ONGO WeChat feed, as actually a number of people on this call probably do, you will see instance after instance of Ministry of Public Security integrating the so-called Article 53 universities and research institutions into their work. I can say much more about that. Many of us have encountered this directly in terms of new procedures for projects and relationships with ONGOs and foundations, or restrictions on international academic exchanges, many of those now codified by regulation, including online academic exchanges and travel. Just to give one example, if this works, and this is just one example, a small grant from an international organization to a particular, I'm just giving one example, a Shanghai-based university and their Zhejiang affiliate, but a small grant from an international NGO or a foundation would require, as of 2018, all of these various steps. And I'm pleased to send this diagram to anyone who wants it. Afterward, my email address is in the Zoom box. But that's just to indicate that the processes have become extraordinarily complex. And as a result, we are seeing much less work between the Article 53 universities and research institutions and others. Secondly, ONGO and the expansion of national security frameworks into Hong Kong. The themes of foreign collusion, national security, and the role of public security, and of course, to some degree, state security, have become extraordinarily prominent in Hong Kong over the past year to year and a half. We are all aware of this, and I know that USALI will be running other programs that discusses some of this in more detail. But we are seeing direct echoes of ONGO frameworks and ways of thinking about the roles of both domestic and international NGOs in Hong Kong, a theme that's probably worth an entire program on its own. But Hong Kong is now, as I think everyone on this call knows, rapidly disappearing as a place from which international NGOs can work in China, can send personnel into China for projects, things like that. And indeed, some of the overseas NGOs that rebased to Hong Kong in 2016, 2017 are now moving out. A third, something which is implicit in Jessica's presentation and that she mentioned, is to the degree to which the provincial public security has become primary in much day-to-day ONGO administration. At the beginning, 2015, 2016, it was the central unit in Beijing, and many of our Chinese colleagues have had contact with the central unit in Beijing that runs ONGO activities. And some of us outside have had some contact with the central ONGO unit in Beijing. But in the years since, much day-to-day work occurs at the provincial level, making it, of course, more complicated for overseas NGOs and others that need to figure out what's happening at the provincial level. There are still individual cases, we know this from documentation, that go up to Beijing, to the central unit in Beijing, but increasingly the provincial has become primary in terms of day-to-day ONGO administration. Two aspects of the policy process that now interestingly involve these ONGO frameworks, and I'll just mention them briefly. One is that when China made the decision to accept certain kinds of carefully selected crisis aid at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, the ONGO framework, the Overseas NGO Law Framework, was fully integrated into that process. And organizations ranging from Give to Asia in San Francisco to the China Medical Board in New York to the Gates Foundation, lots of others, I'm just mentioning a few examples, had to find their way with the help of Chinese colleagues through the ONGO framework to deliver the carefully negotiated and organized assistance to China in various ways. ONGO is not outside the broader policy process. ONGO is embedded in the policy process. On a more positive note, the ONGO framework, the Overseas NGO framework, is embedded in the policy process in a different way. We are seeing in a few cases the development of what I think of as new hybrid purpose entities that are being registered in China for particular uses that could happen in other ways, could happen as companies, but are sometimes happening as overseas nonprofits or social enterprises through the ONGO framework. The best example of this, perhaps, is the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, CEPI, C-E-P-I, which you are forgiven if you haven't heard of. It's probably the specialists in vaccines and pandemic issues that have heard of CEPI. CEPI is a partnership involving private, public, philanthropic, and civil organizations, which is developing vaccines and working with COVAX and other entities. CEPI was registered in China, certainly through the ONGO framework. A law firm in Beijing, which is actually on this call, played a significant role in that. And so we are seeing that's just an example of ONGO and its integration into policy frameworks. For those interested in the use of these frameworks for crisis aid to China and how that differs from, say, 2008 in Sichuan, or perhaps even, because I referred to it, 1976 with Tangshan, which some of us remember well. I've done a short piece on that, and I'm pleased to send that to anyone interested. Finally, and then I'm going to stop, and we're going to turn it back over to Katherine for questions and answers. It's important to remember, of course, that the Chinese concern with molding the nonprofit sector in China, which is very real, is of course not in any way limited to the overseas NGO sector. There is a parallel and much greater set of activities going on with respect to the domestic sector, a bewildering array of initiatives and policies that taxes all of us who try to follow this on a day-to-day basis. But let me say that the really interesting debate that has begun to emerge with respect to the revision of the domestic charity law, a debate which has gone further and deeper than at least I anticipated, and perhaps some of our colleagues anticipated, is a debate that's worth tracking, something I'm writing about this year. And for our purposes today, it will be interesting to see, and I don't know, it'll be interesting to see whether this has any impact on overseas NGO implementation and strategy issues. It is not so far a significant piece of the debate that's going on about reworking the domestic charitable institutions legal framework, a legal framework which has been restrictive and cumbersome and has attracted significant criticism from within China. But it will be very interesting to track that, and especially to see if it has anything to say about the overseas NGO situation. So with those 6 thematic points, if you will, I'm going to turn it back over to Katherine. And I see questions in the question box, and we welcome the questions. And again, we welcome everyone who is here today, especially our colleagues from China, who it's great to see.
So thank you both very much. It feels like we've teed up quite a few things that we can now dive into. One thing I'd like to just clarify a little for those who are in the audience who may not have been following this historically, may not be familiar in detail with the law, is the question of, nomenclature when we talk about NGOs. For purposes of this conversation, I think we are saying NGO, non-governmental organization, as a kind of shorthand for all non-government, non-profit organizations. And this is really because the Chinese law does that, right? So the Chinese law itself defines all of the organizations that are affected by it as being non-profit, non-government, and essentially non-mainland China. The 3 nons, so outside of mainland China. And so when they say overseas, they include Taiwan and Hong Kong and Macao in the overseas. And for nonprofits, they include any organization that is organized as a nonprofit. So that means, as Jessica was mentioning, commercial trade promotion groups, chambers of commerce, organizations that actually, when you hear the name, you might think, well, that's more of a commercial, their interest is commercial, their interest is trade and so on. So all of them get wrapped up. And therefore, when we talk in our shorthand about NGOs, we are actually including them as well, and not just, the Red Cross or Save the Children or groups that you might think of as kind of paradigmatic NGOs. So that being clear, let me ask both of you, why does this matter? Why did I call this a foreign relations piece of legislation? And should somebody who's sitting in a business, a for-profit, who's not directly affected, care about this?
I can talk, although Mark, you should feel free to jump in. I mean, at the risk of saying things, I feel like people say a lot, and it sounds very trite, but people exchanges are really, really important. Having people interact, solve problems together, look at societal issues outside the auspices of government is incredibly important for building sustainable and durable relations over the long term in terms of foreign policy, but also just in terms of how is the country functioning? Are people getting what they need? Sometimes government always isn't the best at assessing and delivering things that the community needs. And sometimes, nonprofits, NGOs can do that work better. So I'll let Mark pick it up. Maybe he can answer the question of why businesses should care.
I agree with everything Jessica said. Let me just add maybe one point. From the beginning, literally, even before the Cultural Revolution, international nonprofits were a kind of bellwether for the ability to act with and interact with our Chinese colleagues and Chinese institutions. And that's certainly been the case since the late 1970s, when a few organizations, UNICEF and the NGO agencies, then eventually Ford in the early 1980s and others, began activities that were contributory to China. And the Chinese authorities are well aware that the international nonprofit community is a kind of bellwether, is looked at within China and outside China as a key example of the policy process involved with working with foreigners and foreign institutions, and that impacts on those institutions don't exist in isolation, but as part of a broader strategy and a broader process in China. So that's one reason, and I think this echoes what Jessica was saying, why this is important. we see parallels between what's happening with overseas NGOs and what's happening with other kinds of entities in China as well. While the policies may not always look exactly the same, the process of molding the work with the foreign, restricting the policy process to one or two channels. In the case of the overseas NGOs, primarily one channel, the Ministry of Public Security, including now the universities and research institutions. This is something we see in other fields as well. So this is not a field apart. It's part of a policy process of narrowing, restricting, and molding in various fields of activity. And I'll stop there.
Mm. So, Mark, that very nicely leads into where I'd like to go, which is what should the role of civil society organizations be in the larger landscape of US-China relations? So in just the last few years, even as this law was passed, took effect, and now has been implemented for amazingly 5 years already, we've seen such a dramatic change in the overall tenor of US-China relations. Not that in 2017 US-China relations were wonderful. They were not. They were quite stressed, but they were much better than they are now. And there was a lot more government level conversation going on 2015, 16, 17. Most ministries and departments in the US government had contacts with their colleagues, their direct opposites in the other institutions, and engagement and dialogue and the governments across all of the different sectors of activity was much more robust than it is now. But now we have moved from talking about engagement to talking about decoupling. And currently the official policy in the US is the 3 C's: confrontation, competition, collaboration. Somehow we're supposed to toggle amongst those 3 modes of interaction. We often say or hear in the nonprofit world that when government relations are bad, this is where civil society can play a meaningful role. And of course, you alluded to history, and we know, famously that civil society did play a role in the 1970s in the confidence building process that led up to normalization of government relations in 1979 between the US and China. So my question is, what role should we hope to see civil society play now? Is it up to civil society to try to fix the relationship, or more modestly to try to mitigate the stresses and keep the window cracked open? Or what is this role that civil society should try to play? And then we can talk about whether the law allows civil society to play that role.
I think it's really important here to disentangle the notion of NGOs as carriers or implementers of US policy or US foreign relations, and as being carriers or implementers of a set of values that they may have. And so I think it's dangerous to assume that US-based NGOs or NGOs based elsewhere are always going to be, working in concert directly with US foreign policy interests, or US foreign policy interests. That said, I think that there are a number of values that ideally I would like to consider that we have in this country about free speech and about other things that I would hope that NGOs can find ways to keep alive and to find ways of implementing even within their own organization. I think that's where the challenge is. It isn't so much you have to carry the burden of bringing this relationship, but can you still enact what values you have as an NGO in this time? And I think if you have a set of core values that you can enact, then that's great. And you are then perhaps being a steward of the relationship, but the burden, I think, is on retaining those values rather than being a steward of the relationship per se.
Once again, I agree with that. We in the overseas NGO community, I'll refer to it as we, and many of the people on the call, one way or another, work in the overseas NGO or foundation community. But we're not representatives of the United States government. It's up to the United States government or other governments. We have people from many countries on the call, each of which has their own bilateral or regional relationships with China. It is not up to us to take the slack when the bilateral relationship fails. We don't want to fall into what was and sometimes still is an old Chinese trope about international NGOs and foundations being part of or linked to or agents of the US government. We're different. And if we have a rationale for being in China, it's because we have our own rationale for being in China. This is a very difficult time, and it's only gotten more difficult since 2012. And in the particular legal context we're talking about today, only more difficult since 2016, 2017. And so a range of organizations have to think and are thinking very intensively about what their rationale is for being in China. In some cases, those rationales are limited but extraordinarily valuable. Reforming medical education, bringing COVID aid in particular times to China as part of a broader program of activities in China, working on poverty alleviation, working on education and health. Those are extraordinarily valuable things to do, and in those kinds of organizations, we may be seeing those issues being raised less. For other kinds of organizations where their freedom of movement, freedom of activity in China has been reduced, as it has been in many cases, most cases, by the overseas NGO regime and framework, that is sparking more discussion within those organizations. The window cracked open a formulation that was one of those that Katherine started with, is something that resonates with me, and that's in part because, as Katherine knows well, I served in the Ford Foundation in Beijing before, during, and after Tiananmen, and we engaged in a debate within the Ford Foundation, as everyone on the call knows, and more broadly in the American nonprofit community about whether to stay engaged in China, beginning on June 5th, 1989. The decision was by most organizations, including the organization I worked with at the time, to stay engaged in China. I'm not drawing a direct parallel between the last 5 years or the last 10 years and the year to year and a half after Tiananmen. That's not an accurate parallel to draw. But it's not the first time that we have been through these wrenching conversations about the value of staying engaged with China in the civil society community. And I dare say it's not going to be the last time we're going to do that. The idea of staying engaged and hoping that more flexibility is possible in the future, that was a major point in 1989, 1990. It's a major point for a number of organizations today that are staying in China under sharply reduced, narrowed circumstances in terms of what they can do. But 5 years is a long time, and 10 years is an even longer time. And reckoning is coming for some overseas civil society organizations, NGOs, foundations, and others that are going to have to begin thinking much more directly about the degree to which it remains consistent with their values to stay working in China. Not all organizations. There's a range of organizations for which it just makes sense to be active in China. Climate change, lots of others. But this reckoning is coming for certain kinds of organizations, and we'll have to see how it plays out.
So there have been a number of reports published recently, just the last few months in the US, about the role of civil society and NGOs in US-China relations. So one that I'm thinking of is the Carter Center report that came out. Another is not specifically about NGOs, but it's about engagement with China, the National Committee on US-China Relations. And there's a lot in both of those. I recommend them highly to everybody to read if you haven't. But one of the ideas that we see in the Carter Center report, which is called Finding Firmer Ground, the role of civil society and NGOs in US-China relations, one of the ideas there is that, that there are important topics in which the US and China as nations, not just governments, but as entire nations and peoples, have concerns led in all cases, I think, by climate change and public health. They had a two-group consultation process where they talked to Chinese on the one hand and Americans on the other, and both the Americans and Chinese, as I recall, ranked those as the most important issues for what they called cooperation. And then there were other issues identified for dialogue. And then the most difficult issues were, set aside for management, things like the South China Sea and Taiwan and Hong Kong and so on. And the conception that we get from this is that nonprofits can be the locus of this cooperation and dialogue. So when I say that they, pick up the slack when governments can't talk to each other, I think the vision is that NGOs, in this case, obviously not talking about some small group that is bringing education to a rural area, but groups that engage more in policy framing and specifically, of course, work on things like climate and public health, that they could be leading a dialogue and that they could be thrashing out specific implementable action areas where the two countries could be collaborating, not necessarily through their governments, but through, other actors in society. Is this do either of you see this actually happening anywhere? And is this something that is realistic to envision when we have an overall climate of such strong mutual suspicion?
Well, I'm afraid the question to a significant degree probably comes close to answering itself. Some of the aspirational goals in those kinds of reports have to be aspirational at this point, given the situation in China and given the level of conflict between China and many of its partners, many of its interlocutors around the world. So the kinds of positive relationships, Katherine, that you're mentioning are, for the most part, just not possible today. 5 years into the NGO regime and 10 years into the current situation that we have now, the question for many overseas NGOs, foundations, think tanks, which we haven't talked about too much today, it's a much smaller number, and of course business associations, is the question of holding on, keeping the window cracked open and waiting to see if better times are coming. We happen to be meeting today, in effect, a 5-year anniversary of this particular legal framework at a time that is almost really a low ebb in terms of the kinds of conversations, the kinds of cooperation, collaboration that can occur. And so in that sense, I think that the aspirational kinds of things that the reports discuss that you're mentioning really aren't possible right now. Will they be possible in a year or two? Will they be possible in 3 to 5 years? It's obviously impossible to know the future, but there are a number of organizations that are doing what they can in China under severe constraints and with their partners under severe constraints in China, and are waiting to see, at least for the next couple of years, whether the situation will begin to allow more flexible activity. And with that, I will turn it over to Jessica.
I'm afraid I share Mark's view. I really hope that it's the low ebb, because that means things will improve. I wanted to just flag too, though, that you can't always really neatly separate sensitive and non-sensitive issues or even organizations, right? I know I can think of examples in the past where a group that was working on more environmental sort of issues, was very, very concerned about what their branches outside of China were doing. And there was conversation in the organization, do we have to stop these activities in, I'm making up a country, Austria, so that we are able to still operate in China? And those activities had nothing to do with environment, but they could have knock-on effects. And so it is just really hard in the current climate, even for groups that are working on issues that should be really easy to cooperate on, to necessarily even be able to do that, given maybe they have interests elsewhere or their activities elsewhere, which the Chinese state links together very tightly and tries to enforce compliance even abroad outside of China.
So one thing I want to maybe flag, though, is the role of GONGOs, government organized NGOs. So when we think about, again, as we said at the top, when we talk about NGOs, we're talking about really a stew of so many different types of organizations and characteristics. And one of them that we see less of here, although we do have some of our own GONGOs in the US, is this government organized NGOs. And I have been hearing of stepped up initiatives from GONGOs and Chinese GONGOs reaching out to foreign counterparts, where they are eager to start dialogues and they want to engage in conversations about various kinds of issues with other what they consider peer organizations, either peer because they're large or substantial or well known, or because of their being well connected with US decision makers. They are interested in engaging these conversations. So it may be, ironically, that this is a situation where if you look at this part of the picture, you see more of these kinds of activities, whereas the smaller organizations that you were referencing, Mark, that are struggling, are living in very much a different world, which reinforces the larger story we've been talking about here of control, because it does seem as if the party is driving a narrative of what civil society should look like. That is a very much a government directed, if not directly managed, if not actually incorporated into government institutions, very much directed and controlled on the Chinese side, so that some of what we thought of as civil society activity has migrated to a certain special category of civil society, which I know certainly in the States we dispute to what extent it should be regarded as civil society. And that leads me to the next sort of issue I'd like to put on the table before I start taking some of these excellent questions, which is the direction that the Chinese government wants to take civil society engagement and people-to-people relations. And we can see that it is the direction of official civil society, of government-led civil society. The Communist Party International Liaison Department has been very active in encouraging these kinds of exchanges, which to some extent are reminiscent of the people-to-people exchanges that we saw in the 70s and 60s with Soviet bloc countries. Or at least I see some similarities there. And organizations, American and other foreign organizations that want to continue operating in China, to some extent have been told that if you want to be in China, you have to be part of this other parallel world of exchanges that we are organizing. And one of the big organizing principles or themes for the activities of these organizations is the Belt and Road Initiative. And so the Chinese government has established sort of networks of organizations, of international organizations along the Silk Road, and in association with the Belt and Road, and they hold conferences and meetings talking about how civil society can promote and support the Belt and Road. And foreign organizations have been invited, pointedly invited to be part of that, and have been told that the role that they are expected to play is to support Chinese NGOs or Chinese trusted civil society organizations in going abroad and playing a bigger role on the world stage, raising up China's voice, etc., pursuing the 200-year goals of national rejuvenation and so on. So what does this mean? I think you referenced this a little in your last remarks, Mark, about a reckoning is coming, or I don't remember the exact word you used, but how can foreign civil society organizations pay this price? If this is the ticket for admission, is it a ticket that they should be paying? At what point does engagement in these kinds of exchanges undermine the fundamental values that Jessica, you were just talking about, preserving? In our society, NGOs do not represent the government, do not take direction from the government, do not speak for the government. How can organizations navigate this particular requirement or, firm request?
The pressure from China to become involved in Belt and Road initiatives and projects directed toward international NGOs and foundations and think tanks and probably business associations as well goes back to the beginning of Belt and Road in the context of overseas NGOs and the overseas NGO law framework. It goes back to the beginning, to 2017. Substantive partners and MPS units were encouraging international organizations that were being registered or had temporary activities in China to become active in the Belt and Road activities of various kinds, going back to the first 6 months of 2017. It was a strategy from the beginning. It's a specific strategy with respect to NGO, and as Katherine's pointing out, it's a much broader strategy involving the party and other entities. I think the first thing to say, and others may disagree, is that in many cases there are very good reasons to become involved in these activities. To the degree that it involves Chinese nonprofits, usually reasonably close to the state, going abroad for NGO activities in Latin America, Africa, and other parts of the world, and to the degree to which that American and other organizations can contribute to capacity building and broader thinking in that work, that's a good thing. If it also contributes to their being able to stay in China at a very, very difficult time, and we cannot underestimate how difficult this time is for a variety of civil society groups in China, I don't see that as a bad thing myself either. So the first thing to point out is that there's actually some positives to being involved as international nonprofits and foundations in these activities abroad. Organizations in China, and this is sort of a second point, and then we're going to turn it back over to Jessica, probably to disagree with me on some of this, I don't know, is that organizations in China have usually, at this point, quite experienced leadership, either Chinese or foreign, and are adept at balancing the pressure that they receive to be involved in specific kinds of projects such as Belt and Road, and their desire to be involved in the kinds of work that they want to do in China. And this is often, not always, a kind of trade-off and negotiation with both their primary substantive partner and with the MPS unit that they also report to. It's a negotiation from weakness. There's no doubt about that under the current environment in China, the environment over the last 10 years and the environment over the last 5 years. But it is a discussion. And sometimes the agreement to work on certain things abroad, which by itself may in fact be valuable, can also be coupled with the ability to work on certain things in China that are still possible. So I don't see this as entirely a negative. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jessica.
Yeah, I actually agree. I think, there's no, it's not bad to work with governments per se, right? Whether it's the Chinese government or other governments, NGOs do it all the time. So the fact that they're working with the Chinese government, to me, isn't immediately like this is going to be bad, and particularly in places where some of these projects really need to be done. The question really is, it gets back to this question of values. What are the projects you're working on? What benefit is that going to have for local populations? I think that's a really important question, to make sure that the local populations where these projects are being carried out are being adequately consulted. And so if you can maintain your values and feel like you are doing positive in those places, I think that's great. I think the question for a lot of NGOs is, given how politically charged BRI is here in the US and outside of China, does that somehow hurt their reputations outside of China? And I'm not saying that BRI should or shouldn't be charged. It just is a fact that it is. And there's plenty of people who think, everything about it is malign. What kind of cost is that going to have for NGOs, maybe in their home countries? And I don't have a good answer to that, but that's a consideration I think a lot of people have to wrestle with.
Yes, so that comes up in some of the questions we have. I want to quickly, though, mention two things that are in the question queue. There's a question of, will the slides be shared? Jessica, may we share your slides from our website afterwards?
Sure, you can share them. Also, all the images are just they're screenshots from the website. So you can go to the website and they're updated monthly too.
And your website is?
ChinaFile.com/NGO, or you can just search for the China NGO Project.
Okay. And the next thing I wanted to highlight in the queue is, I see someone has posted that her organization has done a small-scale research on how the pandemic has affected NGOs in China, in case any of you is interested in reading it. I don't know, this person has not mentioned what the name of the organization is, so I welcome her to maybe post in the question queue the name of the organization, and maybe if it's available online, the URL, so we can all see it, because I think there'd be a lot of interest in that. So to get to the actual questions, what you were just saying, Jessica, about how the BRI is perceived and whether engagement with it actually undermines the reputation or the trust that the NGO experiences in their home country, I think is a really important issue. One of the questions is very bluntly focused on China. How susceptible are NGOs in China to be characterized as foreign intelligence entities? And I would add to that, what about also in the US? Because we did see in 2018 a congressional committee reaching out to several American NGOs that work in China and asking them to show why they shouldn't be required to register under the Foreign Agents Registration Act as agents of China, because of what they had on their website, information about their projects that they had on their website that said nice things about China, basically, about Chinese policy, so that they were being accused by this particular committee of being agents of China. So this distrust that NGOs themselves face, that they are somehow Trojan horses of their home government or of China for working there, that how does that manifest, and what can NGOs do about it?
In China, this has ebbed and flowed over time, but it's never been entirely absent, including at times, some years, for example, in the 1990s. For some of us, before Tiananmen in 1988, early 1989, when we were working in China, even during what I would characterize as more open times, this suspicion always existed. It's a question of managing it in the context of day-to-day relationships with partners and day-to-day relationships with regulators of various kinds. But at least in China, it never goes away. It is sometimes whipped up by propaganda. It is sometimes, in effect, sort of operating naturally within the system. Those two things can be hard to separate out. But we've seen it all the time. We're happen to be at a heightened level of this now for reasons that we're all aware of. And this is certainly the case now in Hong Kong as well, where we haven't had that much discussion today, and which merits its own discussion in terms of overseas and domestic NGOs. And at the same time, we're seeing heightened suspicion that probably reached its height under the previous presidency in the US with respect to overseas NGOs that operate in the United States. So I just see this as a phenomenon that comes and goes. It needs to be managed as much as possible. It's going to be hard to manage. I am struck in China by the fact that intellectuals and others will continue to bring this up decade after decade. It never quite goes away. And I just think we need to manage it as best we can.
It feels like the Chinese government is always retaining the option to turn this into a national security espionage activity, right? At any point, there was a cartoon that was put out during like national, what is it? It's on April 15th, right? The National Security Education Day.
It's a whole week.
It's a week. Oh, so sorry. I had a really good time translating it a few years ago. That was, the whole cartoon was a foreigner coming and giving money to help incite like a labor protest. And it was part, he was part of an NGO, and this was educating people about the dangers of foreign NGOs. And more recently, what we saw, this obviously had nothing to do with their NGO work, but the two Michaels from Canada were both working in nonprofits. So while it had nothing to do with their work and it had everything to do with the larger political situation, it really shows how vulnerable people working in NGOs can be should the Chinese government decide to exercise that their latitude to declare something, being espionage or working for another government. And yeah, I think that's really alarming right now for people working there.
Related to this is the number of questions in the question and answer box about implementation and enforcement of this regime, because that's related to degrees of suspicion in China. And I was struck at least 3 or 4 of the questions relate to enforcement and enforcement mechanisms. Jessica, of course, has mentioned the case of the two Michaels, the case of hostage diplomacy, in which they happen to have worked in nonprofits, and their work in nonprofits may have made them more vulnerable to their use by the Chinese authorities in this way than perhaps other people who worked for embassies or else other kinds of organizations. But beyond that, we're seeing the need for relatively little direct enforcement in terms of closing organizations and deporting people, because the implementation of this regime is so strong and so enveloping and so all-encompassing around China through the Ministry of Public Security system that the need to actually throw people out of China and close foreign organizations has only happened in a couple of cases, pretty much few and far between. I did a short piece on this last year in an Australian civil society journal, which I, again, would be pleased to send to anyone who wants to write to me at the email address that you see on the screen. But the number of cases is limited. They are serious cases where they occur, but most of what's happening here is implementation of the framework, not enforcement to close organizations and send people out of China.
Mark, could I ask you, if possible, to maybe give us a little more color about those examples that you mentioned of enforcement?
Yeah, we have a couple. We have an American organization. I have to be a little careful here because I sit on their board, so I won't want to only use public information. But we have an American organization that was involved in some capacity building activities in China and was regarded by the public security authorities as having not obtained the proper permits for those activities. And so in one of those cases, it was expunged from the temporary activities tables that the Public Security Ministry maintains and that is so widely available via the China NGO Project. As some of our colleagues in China know, I'll say this parenthetically, the work of the China NGO Project has been just tremendously important to our understanding this 5 years. And there are colleagues in China, and not just academic colleagues, there are colleagues in China who refer to the data that's available on the China NGO Project because that is a presentation of data from China, the best data we have, presentation of data from China that's really very useful in understanding this process. So that's one example. Another example is of a LGBT organization from Hong Kong, whose representative or a representative of that organization was pushed out of Guangzhou, but based on legal activity, I believe, that occurred in Hunan several years ago. We have a series of individual cases, but for me, this is not so much a question of enforcement via closing and deportation, as it is a question of implementation of the framework so that China has allowed to be in place the overseas NGOs, foundations, think tanks, and business associations that it wants to be in place. And then, to move to a different set of questions, those activities are pretty firmly controlled. There is flexibility to come to, I think it's Meng's question. There's flexibility about adding activities, subtracting activities, but we're dealing with a pretty intricate regulatory process in which organizations are always, beginning of the year, end of the year, reporting to the Chinese authorities in two different ways, through their partner and through public security. Sometimes indirectly through the partner. And not surprisingly, what MPS has set up is a system in which implementation is highly effective, and therefore individual enforcement actions can be few and far between. Anyway, those are a couple examples. I think I talk about a couple other examples in the Australia paper, which again, I'm pleased to send anybody. But the issue here is not so much enforcement as it is the development of an all-enveloping effective system from the MPS headquarters in Beijing down to literally the neighborhood MPS level at the sub-provincial level.
Yeah, the cases, of course, that get the headlines are, as Jessica mentioned, the two Michaels. And at the time when they were initially detained, you may recall that a foreign ministry spokesman in China actually brought up the foreign NGO law. And this was after the initial detention, because Michael Kovrig worked for the International Crisis Group, which is a nonprofit, which does not have a registered rep office in China. He was based in, I believe, Hong Kong and traveling in. And when he was initially detained, there, of course, it was not clear to anybody what was going on and why he had been detained. And a foreign ministry spokesman really created quite a firestorm by bringing up the law. Now, his exact words, he did not say that he had been detained in connection with the law, pursuant to violations of the law. He didn't say anything as direct as that, but he mentioned it, which of course led to the logical conclusion that he was mentioning it because it was relevant. Now, after those detentions, which, as Jessica pointed out, quickly became understood as part of the dispute that China was engaged in with Canada and the US over the Huawei case. But after those detentions, there was a great deal of concern among foreigners generally. We saw a lot of talk in the business community about the risks of going into China, of just even entering. Could you be detained fairly arbitrarily? And here we're talking about nonprofits trying to get there, to get in, to have offices and to engage in activities. So how much fear do you hear when you talk with people at nonprofits? I know I personally still hear this all the time, concern about, is it safe to go over for a workshop or whatever? Do you feel that those fears have subsided over time when after it became clear that their detention was not connected to the foreign NGO law? Do you think that those fears within the nonprofit community subsided? Should people be afraid?
I think it's really hard. I mean, the pandemic has screwed up everything about all of our lives. So it's really hard to know how much. I haven't heard it as much in the last year or two, but also it's been really hard to travel to China. So I think we're kind of in a wait and see situation in that capacity. But I feel like when I was talking to people back when travel was relatively easy. They kind of fell into the same sort of divides that you'd see for other things, which is, we are registered, we have good relationships with the government and with our partners in China, I feel fine. And people who maybe they were doing a temporary activity, or maybe they didn't have those solid relationships, felt much more iffy about it. And I don't know whether that is true or not. Like, I don't know if you have a good relationship with your government sponsor, whether that means that you are automatically safe, but that's kind of the vibe I was getting from people.
Yeah.
I agree with the tiers that Jessica's putting this in. The ones that were naturally the most concerned in the pre-pandemic times were those who were often from Hong Kong, going into China for informal projects or other activities for which there was not a registered office and there was not a temporary activity project in place. And they had reason to be concerned. What was perhaps most interesting about those, 3.5 years or so, is that in most cases, it became clear that public security and other groups in China were, in most cases, merely tracking those activities. They were not looking to cut off each of those capacity building, meeting, other kinds of activities. And I sometimes heard about groups that were going into China without a registered office, without temporary activity. And I would indicate I would think that that's generally a bad idea. And I then expected to hear about some kind of enforcement action. And it was actually pretty rare that there was an enforcement action. But that's because the security agencies in China were, in effect, gathering intelligence. They knew what was going on. They were watching transfers. They were watching people and gathering information. Now the pandemic context has changed all of that. I do think the nervousness remains, and it'll be interesting to see as travel resumes to China at some point in some year whether that nervousness gets expanded or not once again. On the academic side, we all know that there are academics that don't want to return to China for work or research, and at the same time, there are academics who can't wait to get back to China for their work and research. So I do think it's going to be a spectrum. I do think it's going to be a wide variety of people, organizations, and their reactions to all this.
I can just put a quick plug in too. I should have mentioned this before. ChinaFile did a very informal, non-scientific survey earlier this year of past ChinaFile contributors, right? So people who have generally made their living because they are going back and forth all the time. And it was pretty evenly split between people who said, definitely going back or most likely going back, and definitely not going back, most likely not going back. And these are people who, again, like they've made their entire livelihoods and potentially even personal lives dependent on this. And I think that speaks to the level of nervousness that is there.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And we should also acknowledge that enforcement, not of this law, but enforcement against nonprofit employees has been very heavy when it comes to Chinese NGOs. So in the last few years, we've seen quite a few arrests of Chinese workers at Chinese domestic nonprofits, including ones that have been, have legal status, are legally registered, and are not, what we would consider, traditional political dissidents in their activities, which leads me to the question of the role of the experience of Hong Kong-based nonprofits. So, Jessica, I know that you have tracked as well, the Hong Kong, Macau, Taiwan-based nonprofits, because they are part of this pool. As we said at the beginning, I believe, in fact, that the second largest group of registered rep offices in the cohort is Hong Kong-based organizations, right after US-based organizations. And we also know that that's the tip of the iceberg, because Hong Kong just traditionally has had such thick interactions, including, all of the corporations or the tycoons in Hong Kong who came originally from some village in China, and so set up a family foundation or a corporate foundation to fund activities in their hometown, etc. What do you see or hear, either in the data or otherwise, about how those exchanges are unfolding now that Hong Kong has undergone the changes, the political changes that it has had, the national security law, et cetera.
Yeah, in addition, so it's true that Hong Kong is the second most number of representative offices after the US or US-based organizations. I don't want to make it sound like these are instruments of the US or Hong Kong. But in terms of temporary activities, temporary activities carried out by groups based in Hong Kong far outstrip anybody else, including the US. They are number one. And I went back a couple weeks ago to look and see, has that changed since the law? And we don't, I mean, as I noted, there's a general drop off in the number of representative offices and a smaller drop off in temporary activities. And the percentage of those being carried out by Hong Kong based organizations hasn't changed. It's basically the same. So my inference from that is that, you know, the law has been effective in that, like, the groups that are successfully carrying out these legal activities are already doing things that Beijing is okay with, and therefore they have not had to really change how they're operating. But that definitely does, as with all the rest of the data, it does not get at what is going on kind of below the surface and not going through the legal mechanism.
Mm-hmm. So there are a couple of questions I want to lump together so we can maybe efficiently in our dwindling time get to them. Sean Xie asks about the trend of Chinese NGOs and those, including those with offices, rep offices in China, working abroad on China-related projects. So the office is in China, they have a rep office in China, but the work is mostly projects that are outside China. And of course, that includes my former employer, the Ford Foundation. And Sean asked, do you see any indications that the ONGO law, the overseas NGO law, is being applied to the organization's activities outside of China? And so extraterritorial reach of the law. And then I want to pair that with the question from Helena Kolenda about civil society engagement between Chinese and foreign NGOs outside of China. So that here, the way I understand her question is she's just talking about them doing it, you know, having meetings, having trainings, conferences, and so on, somewhere else outside of China. In both of those cases, there's an extraterritorial question. So that's why I pair them together, even though I think that the thrust of what they're asking is somewhat different. Thoughts about that?
I think the timing is useful here because I think it sort of helps to explain what's going on. Sometime 10 years ago, 12 years ago, we can time it exactly in terms of the poverty alleviation and other people. The policy push was for recognized groups in China of certain kinds to go abroad to work. There's a particular phrase for this. There was a policy push to encourage groups to do that, and a number of groups began to do that for various reasons, sometimes very interesting reasons. And people have written about this, including people who were on the call today. This bolstered legitimacy in China. This added to learning within those organizations and capacity building outside of China. This gave them access to funding that, ironically, beginning in 2015, 2016, was clearly going to become more limited within China. There were lots of reasons for the going abroad agenda, both from the point of view of the party and state and from the point of view of the organizations. At that point, as a growing number of organizations began to go abroad, it became clear that that movement was outpacing the rules in China to deal with that movement. And we've seen this many times in China. We've seen it in some ways with respect to overseas NGOs itself in China, where activity outpaces rules and the system has to come up with rules. We see it in many fields. And that's what happened here. After 3, 4, 5 years of the going abroad agenda, clearly linked to Belt and Road, a variety of groups in Beijing, including but not limited to public security, decided it was time to begin thinking about some rules for this. And we are in the midst of that process now. So there may be some application of NGO-related principles and rules to this through public security, but that is far from the only group in Beijing that's thinking about the now, I don't know if there's a full census, I know there are academics working on this in China and elsewhere, but probably hundreds of Chinese organizations that have set up projects, offices, and other kinds of activities abroad. So I think we're in the middle of an unsettled time of regulatory development with respect to the extraterritorial reach of these organizations. And I don't think it's fully clear yet, because of the interplay of multiple interests and organizations in Beijing. I don't think it's fully clear yet who's going to gain the upper hand in terms of regulating this, and whether in fact we may wind up, at least for a period of 5 or 10 years, with multiple and sometimes conflicting regulatory and policy enactments with respect to this going out process and the process that Helena mentions involving links between Chinese NGOs abroad and external NGOs. As opposed to the ongoing process in China, where the rules are now clear, and it's a process of continuing implementation of the rules and full expansion to the universities, to the research institutes, things like that. The overseas side is much less solidified at this point. And it's very interesting to watch how that's going to happen. MPS may wind up with the predominant role in that regulatory environment, but it also may not wind up with that. And I think we're going to have to wait a couple of years to at least get a real good sense for how that's happening. Over to Jessica.
Yeah, I don't have a good answer for the former question, but for the latter, we definitely know that there's been cases where Chinese authorities have tracked activities taking place outside of China, right? You're talking about bringing people out and having some sort of NGO to NGO conference, workshop, whatever. There's been cases where groups have been tracked abroad to do that. And I think, Katherine, you and I know that.
What do you mean by tracked?
I don't want to get into too many details, but I know that they have been watched by Chinese authorities. And as you and I know, Katherine, from personal experience, that at least sometimes the law has been interpreted by local MPS officials to mean that any transfer of any funds or material benefits like plane tickets can be interpreted by the MPS as violating the foreign NGO law. So if you're an NGO outside and you want to bring, a group or an individual to have a meeting with you, let's say in the United States, and you buy their plane ticket, the authorities could decide that they think that that's a violation of the NGO law if they want to. And so, as Mark was saying, this is really unsettled and unclear.
Yeah. I wanted to just talk briefly again about university exchanges, because this is obviously a topic of great interest to my institute. And Mark has alluded a number of times to Article 53 organizations, the article in the law that says that research institutes, universities that are engaged in exchanges with their peer organizations in China are exempt from the registration requirements of the law, meaning that if an American university or an American nonprofit hospital or research institute wants to have a conference in China with a similar entity, they don't need to have a temporary activity permit. They don't need to have a rep office. But they do have all of these other restrictions that you were alluding to, Mark, and your diagram that you showed us of the different steps of approvals that the Chinese side, the Chinese partner, will have to go through, which is parallel to but outside of the scope of the nonprofit law. And you said, Mark, that I believe you said that there was no question that these exchanges had declined in number. And I was wondering if you could talk more about that, because since these exchanges, if we want to hold a workshop with Peking University or a university in Shanghai, we don't need to register for a temporary activities permit. That means that such data as exists, which is the source of data that Jessica's been showing us, is the Ministry of Public Security data. It's not counted in there. If we do hold that workshop, it's not counted as a temporary activity. So you don't know that I've done it. You don't know if I haven't done it, of course. So how can we tell? assume you're speaking from anecdotal experience. I would, and if that's the case, I would certainly agree that it seems to me we have a lot fewer conferences, international conferences at Chinese universities, and fewer Chinese experts and scholars of different types coming abroad to attend our conferences because of the restrictions that they are under, again, outside of the NGO law, completely independent restrictions on their travel. So what are you seeing? And again, what is the impact of this? Are you as concerned about this deterioration in academic exchange as I am?
Absolutely. I think all of us are concerned about the deterioration, the reduction in academic exchange. When we talk with our Chinese colleagues, they don't generally talk about the NGO legal framework. They talk about the new regulations and policy documents that deal with international academic exchanges, that detail the kinds of bureaucratic and political obstacles to direct work with overseas NGOs and academic institutions, restrictions on online activity, restrictions on travel. I don't think we have good data on this, at least not good data that I've seen. It's often difficult to get data from China about the no's rather than the yeses, something that Jessica referred to in her excellent presentation at the beginning. But anecdotally, I think everyone on the call would probably agree that we have seen over the past 3 to 5 to 8 to maybe 10 years a reduction in international academic exchanges. It's just no doubt it's occurring. A variety of provisions and policy documents. As I said, the growth and power of the party committees, and under the party committees, the internal security units within Chinese universities that for the most part, not always, but for the most part, report over to the party side rather than to the academic side of institutions. So we're just seeing less activity. We're seeing less people come. We're seeing less people be able to join conversations like this as presenters. We're seeing fewer Chinese scholars being able to come out to conferences. And I think most would agree about that. Mm-hmm. Jessica, over to you.
Well, I have almost no insight to this for the exact reasons that you stated. We don't know about the no's. We don't know about the yeses. And because these are technically outside the purview of the law.
Yeah. So we have just 2 minutes left. My last question is about something that I actually think is as important, if not more important than the law that we have just spent 90 minutes discussing, and that's funding. So even before the law came into effect, nonprofits, American nonprofits certainly were suffering from starvation for funding to carry out their activities in China and with China, whether they were trying to do it in country or outside. And that funding situation has only grown much more dire since the law took effect. What's the solution for that? We can talk all we want about NGOs stepping up and engaging and whether they're allowed to and how creative they need to be. But if nobody will fund them, what are they supposed to do?
This is sort of a symbiotic problem. As restrictions increase in China, then funders outside of China become less likely to fund certain kinds of activities in China unless it's directly within their fields of interest and they feel that they can be conducted effectively, in some cases quasi-independently in China. As funding is restricted, as funding goes down, then organizations which wish to work in China have less wherewithal, less legitimacy to go through the very difficult process in China of establishing either a registered office or getting temporary activities approved. And so these two things affect each other. Certainly, we are seeing what you're reporting, Katherine, occurring across a range of organizations. Some of those organizations, because of lack of funding and because of lack of opportunity in China, as a result of the restrictions, are closing. I'm aware of at least several organizations that work more on the labor, human rights side of things, the right side of the diagrams in Jessica's presentation, that are just closing because they can no longer work in China and they can no longer get funding, and those two things are very closely related.
Yeah, so we're going to have to end here, but I would like to end with an appeal to any funders who may be on the call to think about the continued need for funding because if we decry the fact that nonprofits and universities and other organizations are doing less engagement in China and are not being allowed to engage by the Chinese authorities, then at the same time, we need to provide them with the wherewithal to engage to the extent that they are able to, if we value this. You just alluded, Mark, to the element of time. I mean, the bureaucracy that is imposed by the ONGO law requires more time, more staff time, and it creates unique funding challenges for, especially for, but not only for small organization. If you have to spend 4, 5, 6 months of the year preparing all of the reports that are now required for the police, and if your first quarter of the year or even your first half of the year, you are unable to engage in many activities because you're still waiting for approval of your work plan, how are you being funded? So there are special funding needs that arise. And if, as a society, if the community of nonprofits think that this is a worthwhile endeavor, then they need to step up and fund it. So on that note, I'll end. Thank you both very much for a really interesting, rich discussion of an important but often not focused on issue in our bilateral relationship, US and China. And just a reminder that next Wednesday, we'll be having a program on sanctions and human rights in Hong Kong, and it will be at 8 p.m. rather than our usual 9 a.m. starting time. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.